All right, welcome to the Gateway API meeting. At least in California where I am, it's April 2nd, 2024, and we've got a pretty full agenda today, but don't hesitate to add anything else to the agenda that you might want. Let me go ahead and drop the link in chat for anyone who might not be able to find it. Anyone should be able to edit things. And just reminder, this is a Kubernetes community meeting, which means we abide by Kubernetes code of conduct, which just means please be nice to everyone. That's all. Encourage, actually, I think there may be one or two people we haven't seen on a meeting before. If so, if anyone wants to introduce themselves, I'd like to give an opportunity for anyone new or, anyone at all who wants to introduce themselves and talk about what brought them here. Give a couple minutes for that.
And if you are new, we would encourage you to introduce yourself because we kind of like to know who's around and who we're talking to.
Well said.
Yeah. Hey everyone. My name is Sriram. So I was there at KubeCon, and I met a bunch of folks, and ever since I got back, I've been playing around with the Gateway API. So I work at Big Bindery, where I'm building a platform as a service, and we had this feature request for exposing databases outside our cluster at the TCP level. So I was playing around with TLS route and TCP routes basically last week. And yeah, I talked to a couple of folks in the Slack channel, and I see a couple of familiar faces here in the call. Yeah, and that got me interested in Gateway API and how everything works. Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah, likewise. We could use, we have so many implementers represented here, and anytime we get feedback from people who are actually trying to use the API more directly, it's just a huge win. So glad to see you here. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll introduce myself. I'm Sailor. I've been to one of these meetings before, but it's been many months. I work at Nginx on the Nginx Gateway Fabric, and mainly here today just to represent and also talk about an issue that I opened relating to some conditions that I think we'll get to at some point in the talk. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. Very
Thanks
cool.
for being here.
It's been great to see Nginx implementation moving along. So yeah, very cool. All right, let's jump into the agenda then. Because top of mind for hopefully a lot of people is 1.1 release. I know we've been talking about this for a while, but I think we really are in the final stretch here. I have an ambitious goal of getting a RC out, sometime next week. We do need to get sign off from SIG Network approvers, TLs for that. But I'm starting a conversation tomorrow, I think, to see what's going to be involved in that. But I think we have a pretty good idea of what's going to be in scope for this release, and we're just working on the final details on each of these. So
Is there
first
anything in
up,
particular that you think would be controversial? Might be too strong a word, but anything that the tech reviewers might take exception to in 1.1?
yeah, it's a good question. I've had trouble predicting this in the past. That's for sure. If I were going to say anything, I would say maybe some of the stuff we're doing in experimental. I think honestly, if there were anything that were going to be controversial, it would be if gateway merging made it through, then that would, I am certain, trigger alarm bells,
I don't,
with SIG.
yeah,
Um,
I don't see that
but
happening, tomorrow though, right?
I agree. I think
Which, I
it's
mean, that makes
probably
me
going to
sad.
miss. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, good question. I think that's my biggest concern. The rest feel good. So gRPC route, huge thanks to Richard for getting this one lined up. I took it, well, I did the final step yesterday, which is just to formally graduate it to GA because there's a whole bunch of machinery about what should be storage version, what should be served, all these annoying things. But this just needs approval. It ended up being not too bad. I did end up keeping Alpha 2 at least around in the standard channel just so that you could install gRPC route standard if you had it experimental before somewhere in your cluster. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work at all. It's not great, but it seems like the least bad option around. Then there's this parent ref thing, and this is huge thanks to Frank for pushing this one through. He volunteered to take this one up, and honestly, we just need anyone to add an LGTM. I try to avoid unilaterally approving graduations like this, so looking for a second LGTM approval, whatever. On this one, this is a pretty tiny one, but yeah.
You maybe want to hit that, Flynn. I think that you actually need this one.
I just approved the gRPC one and had literally just opened 2777. So
Sweet. Okay.
yeah. Mike is correct. We do need this one, and we need some other things as well on the Linkerd side, but that's on Linkerd, not on Gateway API once this lands.
Cool. Nice. And then there's this conformance profiles bit. Mattia, I don't think Mattia made it. Oh, Mattia, you're on this call. Sweet. Okay.
Yeah.
What takes? I think I looked at this before and it looked awfully close. Is it still in draft mode or is it ready?
Yeah, it's still in draft because we needed to get the promotion of the suite merged before completing this one, because otherwise, we were going to change the documentation and then change the suite again, and back and forth for a useless amount of times. So yeah, since the suite has been merged, the suite graduation has been merged, this one is going to be completed fully these days.
Okay, so we can take this out of draft mode and this just needs an approval. Okay. Cool. Okay,
actually, it has to be completed yet. So I have to work a little bit on it. Okay.
Okay. Do you think you'll have time this week for this one?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay.
Tomorrow probably.
Great. Thanks. Then the next one up, I just added an issue, and it sounds like Dave already. Oh, and Mattia, you already commented on this as well. So maybe this is a non-issue. As I was running conformance tests locally, the commands I used to run didn't work, and I had to add a whole bunch of implementation flags, and I just manually changed things locally to avoid that. But it sounds like the combination of Dave and Mattia have this handled.
I think that if we want to not have all the implementation details specified every time you run the conformance suite, we need to do a little change here and allow users to, well, actually not users, but allows us to either specify profiles, a set of profiles, or just specify a set of tests. So this is something that should be done if we want to keep both the approaches. Otherwise, we can just, sorry.
I think something like that keeps it, because the docs right now are pretty simple of like go test, gateway class X, supported features Y. That's pretty straightforward, and I'd love to keep it as simple, as close to that as possible for somebody who's just trying to run a single test or a small set of tests. Yeah, but I know we'll need some changes here. I just would love to make it as minimal as possible. And it sounds like Dave already has something
Yeah,
similar.
I changed it so that it only needs the implementation flags when you're writing out a report,
Okay.
which
The,
makes
the
that.
problem the problem is that, well, it is not a problem, but even with the David changes, you still need to specify a profile at least, right? So we would need to address that case. So you want to also run the suite without specifying any profiles, or maybe you just want to specify a test case or a supported feature.
Yeah, but I mean, I think the if we have to specify a profile, that's not the end of the world. I'd rather, go one
Okay.
step further and make that optional too. But this sounds like the biggest one. So
Okay.
let me take a closer look at this. It looks like that, Dave, I think your PR already has some LGTM approved something.
Yep.
Okay.
There's just some feedback from Mattia, so I addressed it today.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll defer.
I'll take. No, I was just
I think
saying that I'll take another look after the meeting.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think Mattia, you have enough access to approve this, or actually maybe it's already approved. It's already approved. So I'll defer to Mattia then to LGTM and merge this one.
Sounds good.
Cool. All right, the next one is one that could use a lot of attention because it will have a longer term impact on Gateway API, and this is one basically a follow-up to that doc that I'd written a while ago now. Of doc is a strong term because it was really just a short bulleted list of like, here are the buckets that we could put TLS things in Gateway API, and talked about it some more. And the idea was, hey, maybe we should actually like have a memorandum gap, so just so we don't have things hiding in docs in random places. And so that's what this became. The key thing to all of this is trying to like have common terminology throughout. And you are likely aware and have seen that a number of proxies use terminology like upstream and downstream, but it can be inconsistent depending on which proxy you're using. So I have proposed avoiding upstream and downstream terminology and in favor of front end and back end terminology. So front end TLS and back end TLS. Back end TLS is something that we already have in terms of terminology in Gateway API. But the idea would be front end is anything between front end and gateway, and back end is anything between gateway and back end. Yeah, so this runs through basically where we could theoretically even fit TLS configuration, and then the names that of buckets, not individual fields, but just like here's approximately where config could live and what it might be called. And so you can, one of the things that I think was pretty clear to me as I was running through this is I regret when we were initially developing Gateway API, we just had a listener.tls struct, which made sense at the time, but now, TLS is far more than fits in this one thing. So I kind of want to reserve listener TLS for this. So 1 and 2, basically, the connection between front end and gateway. Currently, it's just 2. Yeah. But client cert validation is what Arco's proposing also in listener TLS. But anything going from gateway to backend, I think, needs another home. And then, yeah, there's basically the other bits, which are the configuring the connection between gateway and backend. We have some portion of that, like we have backend TLS policy for validating a server cert. We don't have anything today to configure a client cert from gateway to the backend. So yeah, this is just, again, trying to propose names and buckets and whatever for what could fit in Gateway API. This is not in any stretch meant to be a commitment that we will do these things. Just if we did, this is where it would sit. I've gotten a couple reviews on this, but because this affects so many of us, I would love to get more reviews and feedback as soon as possible. Just so that we're agreeing on the general direction and terminology here. While I've got it up, are there any comments or questions about what I've got proposed?
Interrupt in chat, but we definitely have a use case for your case number 3 for configuring ingress gateway that is a separate project for integrating with a mesh. I have no immediate plans where to get, but the use case is valid, and I'm glad to see it included in the scope of like what we're kind of laying out here as far as those different split responsibilities.
The gateway to mesh case is fascinating, I think is the word I'm looking for. Yeah.
Yep.
Rob
Yep.
is laughing also because he and I have talked about this some in the past. It is man.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is something that GK very interested in as well. You know, we'd love to connect our managed load balancers to mesh implementations.
All you really have to do is just stick your managed load balancers in the cluster, and then it's easy. But no.
No big deal.
Yeah, we have the same use case on Azure. We have things that you can't stick a sidecar next to easily from a user perspective, and how do you integrate those to mesh?
Yeah.
So
yeah,
the serious part of that one is we probably should, some combination of us probably should get together and talk out of band about that use case a little bit to see if we can come up with something that might lead to a gap instead of just going, oh yeah, we should do that. Yeah.
There's probably other Microsoft folks I can pull into that discussion as well.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. I really do want to get that into like 1.2, you know, the next minor release, because I think there's enough interest, and it you know, it's kind of the missing piece. We have answers to 1, 2, and 4 in flight at some level, and just 3 is just this gap right now. So yeah, cool. Awesome. So yeah, feedback, very welcome on this one. I would love to get this one in soon because it actually, for one detail here, it actually results in a breaking change to backend TLS policy.
Do we have, is Arco on right? Arco is on right now. Hey, Arco, how badly do you think that's going to screw things up for Envoy Gateway?
I mean, it's alpha, so I think we can't do anything about it. So that's a guarantee from upstream. We have
I mean, it's
sorry, that's not quite answering the question. You saying you think Envoy Gateway can put up with it, or are you saying that Envoy Gateway is desperately going to need for the name to stay the same?
I'll put it this way: we have users using the policy, but it is an experimental feature that we are. So it's gonna, it might, just anger some users. So.
Yeah, I think that's very, very unfortunate, for sure. So to clarify what I'm talking about here, just before we go too far, is right now we have backend TLS policy dot TLS, and everything is within that. And the proposal is maybe instead of dot TLS, we should have dot validation, so that you could make room for things that weren't necessarily validation. You know, like that. Right. That's the idea behind the rename. It would also be more consistent if in the future we added corresponding value in gateway specifically. If you know, you wanted to have gateway level CA validation for, you know, the certs that are served by backends. So that's the idea here. I know it is going to be disruptive, and I think it's unfortunate, but I also am thinking, for the sake of the API, if we never, like we've said that we can make breaking changes to experimental, and if we never do, then
Yeah.
people will assume that it's more stable than it's intended to be. I don't want to just change things for the sake of changing things by all means, but I think in this case it could be justified. Candace, go ahead.
Rob, just a quick question. Are you covering pass-through in these name changes at all, or not a concern?
That's a good question. So with pass-through, what is actually relevant here? Not much, I don't think. So I guess no, I'm not really covering pass-through
I feel like pass-through fits in the 1-2 case, in the front end case, where you would be telling the gateway, I want you to accept TLS from the front end and pass it through. So
fair.
I feel like we could wedge it in, but I don't know if it's a great, I don't know how much hammering is involved in that, you know?
Yeah.
We should
And
include it in the doc, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think Flynn's correct. I think it's just a subset of this configuration, but I should call it out as if somebody's doing pass-through, here's the parts that are relevant to them.
And I want to be clear of like, is 4 relevant for pass-through as well? Or is it not?
Yeah, are you passing through all the way? I mean,
yeah. This is
that's one where I would have to check some implementations on that.
That's a good call, Candace. Thank you.
Yeah, that is nicely done. Yeah, I think 4 is that's just weird. Yeah.
And are you listing in this GEP what other things will change? Because we have TLS configuration in many different places.
Yeah. So that is the only change. So I really wish we could change this, but because it's already GA and like we just can't touch it. That's really the only other place we have TLS configuration right now. Arco has something that's proposed that we'll be merging in like the next week, hopefully for validating client certs, but it hasn't merged yet. So there may be some changes based on this memorandum gap, but it actually hasn't merged yet. So, yeah.
And TLS route?
Yeah, TLS route, I guess that's for pass-through, but I think that there's not much to change there. But that's a good point. I guess I should throw that in here as well. I was so focused on how we're handling certs and, validating, passing through, etc. I did not think about TLS route, which is related, I guess. If it's a goal called TLS configuration, we should at least consider what TLS route means. That's just matching SNI is really the only unique bit there.
Yeah.
But should cover that somewhere. You're right.
I mean, it's worth mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely.
And one last comment that really I should have reserved for my review, but I just want to bring it up here while everyone else is in attendance. MTLS. I wouldn't bring it up strongly in my review of the PR, but I do feel like other people might.
Sorry, this PR, right, Candace?
I wouldn't bring it up in my review because I'm not that invested in MTLS myself, in the work that I'm doing, at least not for now. But I know there are lots of people who are, and that would want to see it at least mentioned in here, or would in some ways object to the way that things are broken down in here because it doesn't necessarily relate to MTLS configuration.
To me, MTLS. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Rob.
Oh, sorry. Yes. No, go ahead.
To me, MTLS is what happens when you configure all 4 of these things. And it's
Yeah.
a really interesting question as to whether there's a way we could streamline that. I'm not completely sure that there is, but MTLS also, wow, how do I phrase this one? In practice, I feel like MTLS usually comes up more in the mesh case than in the gateway controller case anyway, where a lot of the stuff that we're talking about with client-server validation in particular, like number one, is often ultimately doing a form of user auth. And then MTLS is talking about workload auth between the gateway and the backend.
Mhm.
So they really do end up being kind of different use domains.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's an interesting one though.
So it
I
could
could put
be
it.
a non-goal or
We could
it could
explicitly
be
mention
addressed.
it as a non-goal for this, yeah.
I think there's basically two categories of MTLS. What this is doing is, I think I agree with what Flynn's saying. If all these pieces are configured, you have MTLS, but it's manually configured and it's a real pain. That's, you know, and what a lot of meshes bring to the table and others as well is some kind of automated approach to MTLS where you just don't have to worry about manually configuring each of these buckets. What I would say is having the manual configuration options is kind of like the first step towards having some kind of automation or improved thing on top, right? And then there's also the idea that maybe sometime in the future we want to provide, because so many meshes are doing like auto MTLS, maybe we want to provide some guidelines for that, but I don't know. But that's like, I can't imagine any mesh user wanting to manually configure all these steps.
There's
When I've talked,
there's one place where I think, I don't know if disagree is the right word, but the work that we were just talking about with a gateway that's not in the cluster that still wants to participate in a mesh
yes,
ultimately is configuring number 3 and number 4.
yeah,
But there has to be some
absolutely,
automation around it too, right?
yeah.
Or at least it would benefit a great deal from some automation around it. Let's phrase it that way.
Yeah,
But for example, I think that if you can configure both number 3 and number 4, depending on what that configuration looks like, I think you could get a gateway controller that's not in the cluster to participate in Linkerd MTLS if you did that.
yeah.
You've
Yeah.
given enough control over what exactly the client cert looks like.
I think the same thing for SDO, and it's like if that is at least a common interface that a mesh can program, it gives
Right.
us one integration to target rather than trying to build an integration with a
Yeah.
dozen different ingresses.
Yeah.
Mind you, I think that in order to do that right now, your gateway that doesn't live inside the cluster would need to be able to read a client certificate out of the cluster, like from a secret in the cluster. And if that's a non-starter, then that will make what I just said almost impossible. But if we can do that, then I think we have a fighting chance of being able to do a low effort integration there.
Yeah.
Yep.
And given that if you're configuring your out of cluster gateway controller with gateway API, you can obviously see resources in the cluster. That seems at least potentially promising. So maybe the MTLS thing is to say, to note that you can sort of do MTLS manually, but it's a non-goal to do a full MTLS integration with a service mesh or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's very fair. Cool. Well, that's great discussion. I'm excited about the future where hopefully in the not too distant future, we've provided a way for gateways that are running out of a cluster to connect seamlessly to a mesh. So
yeah, that would
we'll
be
see.
cool. With respect to the breaking name change, I kind of hate to say it, but I personally lean towards, yeah, we do need to actually make some changes in experimental for the reasons that Rob was mentioning, but there's an Envoy Gateway meeting on Thursday, 2 days from now. So maybe we can talk about it there and find out how awful people think it's going to be.
Should this gap also highlight the properties in the validation block as well? Because I know like for front, Arco wanted to validate multiple host names, but right now backend only has a single host name.
I'm trying to make that's a really good question. I'm trying to make this gap not too detailed, just to, just giving the buckets and making sure we have consistency there. But maybe I need to make it more clear that within each bucket, we need to make sure that the capabilities are as consistent as possible. Given that, I do think that there's actually rationale for, like, there's certainly a difference between what we're doing here of validating a client cert versus validating a server cert. And so there's going to be some, like, for example, one of the things we're doing when we're validating a server cert is we have an option to trust well-known CAs, something like that, well-known roots. And I can't imagine that ever really making sense when validating a client cert, as a rough example. So I think there's going to be some variation, but yes, we certainly want there to be as much consistency as possible, even within these buckets. And maybe I just need to make that a higher level goal, but I don't want to get into like every individual field name here because then we'd never merge this, I think. Is that fair?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe, another thing is we could continue to expand this out and over time. But for right now, I think the most important thing is just getting the high level agreement on where things fit. Cool. All right, well, I've got some work to do on that, but also if you've got time to take a closer look via code review, I would appreciate some more eyes on this because I do want to see this merge this week because it's blocking Arco's PR for client cert validation. But yeah, that's it on that front. So let me run through. Speaking of Arco's PR, Arco, do you have any updates on this? I know there's been some discussion here.
Yeah, I just waited, I think, until we just decide on the naming based on your gap. The one thing I'm probably going to do is remove the SAN because it's we don't have complete consensus. I think from multiple reasons. One is all implementations might not be able to support it, as well as I think three things. It might fall into the odd Z bucket, and the third thing is the rate of churn of the validation might be different from the rate of churn of the odd Z field. So
yeah,
for those three reasons, I'll add that maybe in I'll add that into the gap as to why we're not dealing with it right now.
Yeah, it's kind of sad because I would still like to find a place for this to fit in Gateway API, and I agree, like, with what John's saying here is that if we can't actually verify the identity in the certs, we're only kind of doing it halfway. But I agree with your take that there's enough uncertainty about this, especially around scalability implications and around, have we gone too far into authorization? And if so, should we have an authorization focused API instead of this? Not sure. But yeah, I agree with your take that at least for now, we should just move forward with what there is very clear consensus on and come back to this one. Cool. All right, next up is session persistence. This one is largely on track. I don't know if Grant or Gina are on this call. Grant, I see you. Cool.
Sure.
Any updates on this one?
Yeah, I've been kind of ruminating on this a bit. I made the PR with sort of the background information about naming. But I keep kind of going back to, is it the right name? Because we've had some different opinions. I know Shane and Nick have been very much like, yeah, it sounds good to me. But I don't know. For me, it seems like we might be sort of trailblazing a name here, session persistence and affinity that is already kind of used. I think that might be okay, but then I also wonder, would it be better to just use the naming strong session affinity and weak session affinity, which kind of sucks because it's so long and verbose, and it would be kind of ugly in an API, but I wonder if that would just make it super clear. When you see the name strong session affinity and weak session affinity, it's kind of clear immediately what that, or mostly immediately, what the connotation of that is. Whereas session persistence and session affinity is not super clear right off the bat. So I've been kind of ruminating on that.
I'm not going to lie,
where-
Grant. If I see strong and weak, I don't necessarily know what you are talking about at first glance. Session persistence and
Sure.
session affinity. I went through and read this, and on the whole, I thought this looked really good, actually. Session affinity to me is a thing that we talk about from the perspective of web browsers, and I think people have probably a decent understanding of, a decent intuitive grasp of what session affinity is, which I think makes it a useful term. And then talking about persistence as a broader scope makes sense to me. So I don't know. I think whatever we come up with, we're going to have to define and then just be internally consistent. And I think persistence and affinity are fine.
Yeah, I just echo what Flynn said. I think we've been staring at this so long that it's very easy to second guess what we landed on. There are, as you've noted well in this, there are compelling reasons to use sticky sessions or some other term because persistence has different connotations for Java developers or others. I think we can't possibly find any term that's going to be perfect here, but I do really like the terms that you've pushed for so far, session persistence and affinity. I think those are the least bad options personally, and I wouldn't question it too much. At some point, we just have to say, yeah, exactly. I mean, Gateway API doesn't care about Java. We don't, but
our API is called Gateway API. I mean, at some point you just stick with something.
Yeah.
I think I wrote this on the PR, but my opinion was it was good of you to take some time to think about it, because we did have somebody from KubeCon take the time to open a discussion about it because it was confusing from their perspective. But I agree with what Flynn and Rob just said, with the added thing, which I think I wrote down in the PR, just document more of this like comparison stuff, which you already did the work on. Document that, be done with it. Let's just go with what you have. That's my opinion.
Yeah.
One of the
naming is never perfect. At some point, we have to just say what, document what we mean and move forward.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, it's unfortunate, but it is just whatever name we choose, we will regret in a year from now. It just doesn't matter. As long as we wrote down,
maybe not tomorrow, but soon for the rest of your life.
Yes. There was a time that Gateway API seemed like a great name, and well, I mean, it is what it is. It's the name we have, but yeah. Anyways,
it's better than Services API.
It sure as hell is. Yeah.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, it was Service APIs plural, which was like the most confusing. So incremental improvements. But no, if you make this not a draft, actually I think I already approved it, but just ping me if you need help getting that through. There's another one on session persistence, which Gina added. I know myself and Grant have reviewed it, and there's Grant, you may have more context here on this thread you've got. Is there anything that needs more eyes on this one?
I not necessarily. I think we're just having a discussion on when you attach session persistence at a service level, does it mean that at a route rule level, the cookies are different? And I'm having, I assumed it was the same. So when you attach to a service, your cookie is the same for any route, or any route rule. And I think Gina sort of made a point here that it wasn't. So we're kind of talking about that. I had a question about, well, if you can set the name, then that kind of confuses me, because then it has to be the same. Or I think it has to be the same if you have the same name. So I think we need to have a discussion there. If anybody's interested, please jump in.
Okay, good to know. Yeah,
Sounds
I
good.
had not
Yeah.
been following this closely. I'll take another look at this. Thank you.
And thanks
Cool.
again for your diligence and thoroughness on this gap, Grant. You've been putting in a lot of effort and like making sure you've been very responsive to everybody. It's been great.
Yeah, I mean, this gap deserves to be named persistence because it's required a lot of persistence from you to get through.
It pays off, persistent pays.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, thank you a million times for pushing this one through. I know it's been a long haul, but I think we are hopefully there this week to get this across the line. Cool. The last one I want to at least cover is the gateway merging. I think this is maybe a bridge too far. We've tried and had some good discussion on this one, but there's still a number of open items on this. So I don't know if it's realistic to get this one in time.
Should I about the cross namespace stuff? Because I think that's the contentious bit.
Yeah, so I have my concerns, and I also wanted to I really want to at least have explored the alternative approaches here, like understanding the use cases clearly enough that we can say this specific alternative doesn't work, or just I can't just survive with double the listeners in a gateway. I actually need more gateways, and this is why. I can't do this at the route layer because X, I feel like before we go too far in adding the complexity directly to gateway, I'd love to at least work through the alternatives that could potentially work and say why they don't, kind of thing. Or maybe they do, and if they do, that's amazing. Because anything that is.
I guess a follow-up would be because I was, for example, moving TLS certs to routes. I always thought was off the table based on like a GitHub discussion from 2 years ago, right? So if that's
I mean,
it would be great to, because it actually might make sense. Like, hey, I can bring my own cert for a route, right?
That was actually a very popular thing that we pulled out, but I will say, just because it was off the table then, it may be a less bad alternative. Like, it may add less complexity than all of this, right? Like, if we're looking at overall complexity of a solution, maybe that's less complex than the full set of things. I don't know, but
I think I need engagement on this gap to know about those alternatives, and the ones that were prior vetoed as not being viable but now are, right? Because if I could, for me at least, if I could do said thing for the key native use case, like TLS on the route makes it easy for me, and that's what I want. But I know, for example, like Istio, and then I think there's a whole bunch of other use cases for like IoT. They do want some sort of merging, so which then becomes like a separate thing. So like if I could pull out like a GEP that's more niche for Knative's use case for like HPO1 certs that are very fully qualified with no wildcards, then I could do that.
Would it be possible for you to just list out the things that you actually need from Knative's perspective, and then
I think
maybe
it's,
someone from the.
it's in
Okay,
the-
so you
So
but
yeah.
has that been merged with like what I guess mesh? Like I think Istio in particular also has some goals here. Are those all like kind of mixed together? Like maybe we should have like separate sets of goals for separate things just so we can see like maybe this can be solved this way and that can be solved. Like maybe these aren't the same thing. I don't know. I'm just trying to make sure we're thinking
David,
through all.
are the use cases in
I
GEP 1713 and I just haven't read to them yet?
It's all
some
there.
questions.
Okay. I apologize for not reading to that yet then.
I have some questions. I just got back off PTO this morning, so forgive me if I don't have everything in my head here still. What status are we trying to move this one to?
It's just provisional.
Well,
And do we have in mind a good way to create a conformance test for this?
I think so.
I think we do. Like that's half the reason for this is because right now the spec says like you can do this, but there's no real strict guidance or expectations for what happens. And this basically gives us the structure to be able to even write a conformance test for it.
Right. And the more important thing, I think, there's what happens, but also we want to have a conformance test that says what doesn't happen. Like there's things we don't want to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
So if we just stop fiddling around in 3 million lines of comments and we just take a beeline, say, okay, it's provisional, let's get a conformance test going, get something that kind of starts making it, saying what we want in code, and then say, hey, every implementation, can you pass this? Maybe that would be a better way to move the conversation forward.
I think so. I think it's not necessarily a question of if it's possible, it's more if we're finding if we're solving the right problems. And I guess would be what I'm saying, right? Like if we really truly understand the problem, like Dave, you mentioned you have goals. Well, you have goals here. Is this really all there is, or is there?
No,
The
they look
introduction.
introduction.
Sorry, what was that?
The introduction highlights some of the
Okay.
use there.
Okay. Okay, so this really is for Knative. This is certs primarily. Okay. And then so I guess we could use some help from the mesh side. At least I know Istio is interested. I don't know if other meshes are interested in this, of kind of filling in what they are interested in here.
So meshes don't use gateways. So if we're talking about
Kuma
merging
does.
gateways, if we're talking about gateways, then Kuma
I
uses
think
gateways.
Istio is
My-
also planning on it for waypoints for ambient.
Yeah.
All right, so evidently I'm just wrong, and sane meshes don't use gateways, but other meshes do. Where I was going with that also was that, Linkerd, if we assume that at some point Linkerd does an ingress controller, then suddenly we will become interested in gateways, but it's, to me, a kind of a different use case than the way normal meshes are trying to do things. And, if you're talking about Istio ambient, that's a very specific thing that is pretty different from the normal mesh thing. Shane, how does Kuma use gateways right now?
Ingress, and I do not believe they need merging. We do
Yeah, so we're
merging
back
on
to ingress again.
our ingress controller that's not in Kuma. We do merging, but that merging was written an eon ago in the early days of Gateway API, and I don't remember exactly how it works. But I do think that if we just had a test and it said, here, these are the things you should and should not do, we'd run it and say, oops, we're doing or not doing these things.
To me, the interesting things about gateway and merging are, first, one of the things that we have definitely run into with Linkerd is having arbitrary hard-coded limits in various gateway API resources tends to push us toward, well, that really in practice ends up encouraging people to use one of the given thing and only one of the given thing because it's easier to explain and easier to code around. And that makes it, interesting. But the other one is from the Ingress point of view, I think certificates are going to be just about the only thing that really drive merging this stuff.
Yeah.
Because they are the resource that doesn't map one-to-one with anything like ports or IP addresses or anything like that. And the fact that IPv4 addresses are so scarce has driven the need to merge this sort of virtual host concept for, I don't know, decades now. So that's not going to go away until the grand IPv6 revolution, which I'm sure will be just 2 years from now, right?
I think
Yeah.
it's tendency as well. So for example, for native at
If
least,
you
would want
if you
also.
have if you have tenancy and you have a bunch of IP addresses, you don't care about this nearly as much as if you have tenancy and only one IP address. And now you're back to certificates at the thing you're exposing, right?
I hate, this is a very good conversation. I do want to come back to it, but I feel especially bad because Mike and Sailor added something to the top of the agenda, and then I added a whole bunch of V1.1 stuff thinking, oh, I'm sure we'll have time for this, and we haven't yet. And I want to give them time to at least discuss a little bit about this before we completely blow through time. So I do want to come back to Dave's thing. I do want to make sure that Mike and Sailor get time. So yeah, sorry to disrupt that, but I just want to make sure we can get to this. Sailor, can you give like a short, I think Sailor, you're still on the call, right? Yeah, can you give a short overview of what you're thinking here?
Yeah, so
if that's possible.
Yeah, I'll try my best to kind of summarize. Basically, the topic was brought up about adding a resolved refs condition for a gateway class for the parameters ref. And that kind of led us down a couple different discussions. One of those being specifically related to the condition and how it coexists with the existing invalid parameters reason that we have on there for the accepted condition. And Mike laid out some event flows here and what the possible outcomes could be. And then also the question of what would the conformance of that condition be? Is that a required condition? Since resolved refs on routes right now, at least in the test, is required. So that was kind of the points, the questions around the condition itself. And then there was another discussion that came about from this, which I think is actually exists, a problem that could exist today even without this condition. And that's basically if an implementation supports dynamic changes to a parameters ref and those parameters go from valid to invalid, what is the behavior downstream? And so without going too into the weeds here, you can kind of read it in this statement. It's basically, does a gateway class become invalid, and what happens to the rest of the configuration in that case? So that was kind of the other part of what came out of this discussion.
It's a particularly nasty, like, again, fuzzy edge of Gateway API spec where we have a recommendation in the spec that when you create your gateway class and you create a gateway from it, that it is a snapshot template. We don't enforce that in conformance or anything like that. So different implementations may have different expectations or behavior when you change things, or even just like what should happen when you initially create a gateway class with either a bad parameters ref or a valid parameters ref to a list of configuration that may have one thing that's invalid in it. And this is something where, depending on how the gateway class is used, I feel like GKE, for instance, might have like very different behavior than some of like the software defined implementations.
Yeah, no, you're completely right. Thank you for raising this. This is a big thing that we should we should figure out. Yeah, I mean, GK obviously we have our own thing, and we kind of cheat a bit by creating and managing our own gateway classes. So that makes it a little bit easier for us. But the treating a gateway class as a template is something that we obviously very much want to do to avoid just a nasty blast radius, but we clearly didn't think about what if that gateway class was invalid when the gateway was created and you fixed the gateway class. Surely that should be, I don't know. I haven't solved that yet, but I mean that seems like something like you would want to do. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for raising this. I will owe a comment on this one ASAP. Yeah, this is like you said, a rough part of the spec right now, around the edges that have not been well defined.
I think this is also something that John Howard had a PR for like the infrastructure thing on the infrastructure field on Gateway that currently just adds like annotations and labels to copy it to the underlying infrastructure. It originally had a gateway scope parameters ref. And I think it was removed because it was like, why can't we just have it on the gateway class?
Yeah.
I think that this is part of the answer to why not, and may help clarify that use case more.
That's a good way to bring that full circle, because I think this is a very compelling reason to have gateway level config that I hadn't really thought through before. If someone wants to add that specific comment here, just so it doesn't get lost in the discussion, I think that would be very, very helpful. Cool. Well, I know we're at time here. We ran out of things to discuss. Well, ran out of time to discuss. Yeah. So thank you everyone for great discussion. Encourage, especially looking at the reviews that are tied to this release, because we are really trying to push this release out ASAP. I also want to thank Dave for his unending work to backfill conformance tests. Conformance reviewers, if you can please take a look at this one, at the multiple PRs. And then I created some chaos here, and we'll discuss it in the next meeting more. And yeah.
Here,
With that,
is there sorry, go ahead, Arco.
Is there a date for the release? Just a approximate.
Yeah, so I mean, initially we'd said April. I am really hoping that we can get there. We'll have a lot more confidence when we can get an RC out, and I am trying to talk to some of the TLs and SIGNet this week to see what their calendars are like, how quickly we can get their reviews in. And my goal is to have everything merged and settled on our side so that we can hand it off for review next week. But then it's going to depend on, how quick we can get that review.
Rob, I was going to ask if there's stuff about separating the CRDs that you want to toss out so that people can look at asynchronously, so that we can come into the next meeting fully prepared to beat you up to discuss it.
I think it's going to be very unpopular among controller authors. So I mean, I just recommend reading it. I think our experimental and standard channel release channels are broken and don't provide the isolation they should. And I'm proposing big changes to that, and those probably won't be popular. That's the TLDR, but appreciate any feedback, comments, etc. on that PR. Cool. Well, thank you so much. I know we went over time, but have a good one.
Thank you. Enjoy.
Thanks, y'all.